Rawls for inviting me to exhibit in this beautiful space. Every single one of you has just been so incredibly welcoming and gracious, and I'm deeply grateful. And then I want to thank people who ventured out today, particularly with that cold drizzle. I mean, I think they really appreciate your taking the time. So, I'm hoping that this is going to be a little bit more like a conversation. These are my cheat sheets, because I can talk extemporaneously about anyone else's work, but my work, I suddenly look out and go, oh! But I'm hoping it to be more like a conversation, and so feel free to ask questions at any time. First, I'll start by talking about the installation, and then how we engage with individual works, what I'm attaining to in the work, and how one series has led into another, and then the way that they all tie together. So first I'm going to talk about the installation, which is why I didn't want chairs in here. When installing it, I take everything into consideration, the whole space, and I think it's crucial for the work to have a relationship one piece to the next, but also to the space. And while these relationships don't necessarily change the individual works themselves, they do create a kind of balance. And the balance, I think, is what makes you feel welcome and feel invited in and feel like you're part of the space. And I think that allows for the conversation to begin between you and the work of art. I'm going to share a brief biographical note. I generally don't do that all that often, but it really relates to how I think about what I'm doing. And that's what's established my relationship and orientation in the world and has driven my studio practice from the start. And that's the fact that I grew up at the ocean. And that really grounded me in the world. I always knew where I was in relation to everything else. As long as the ocean was on my right, I knew where north was, I knew where west was, and southwest. And it was foolproof. It was really great. And then I went away to college, and it was in Philadelphia, and there was no ocean. And so I had to come up with some new navigational markers. So I eventually decided I'd use the streets. In Philadelphia, it was Broad and Pine, which is where my college was. But they never quite grounded me in the same way. The other significant thing about growing up at the ocean is the horizon line. And as a child, I spent countless hours sitting there, staring out at the ocean, and wondering what those people were like on the other side, if they looked like me, if they talked like me, if walking on the earth felt the same way. And I eventually got to go. I was invited years ago to give a talk in Ireland, and I stood over there and I looked back across and thought, okay, this is what they were looking at this whole time. But there's one final thing about that, and that really plays into my thinking, and it's always been present. And that is that the way that the horizon line extends into your peripheral vision, right? It kind of wraps around you. And in doing that, it also offers what I think are just endless happening. And so those are the things that sort of mark.
Can you hold that for me like that? Yep.
So whenever you go to a museum or a gallery, right, you go and look at the work of art, you can do this. Do this one. You know, it's kind of the way it's done. You do this one. And everything's about this kind of relationship, right? It's this kind of report. But the fact is, most of our time, most of the way we experience the world is peripheral, right? If I'm looking here, it's very tiny. I see all the way out to here, right? And so that idea about that kind of balance is really important. And I think it creates a balance which is crucial for me. I personally need a lot of calm and quiet, both visual calm and audio calm. And so I think that it helps to make things a little more contemplative and quiet, and I think my work tends to veer in that direction more often than not. So to this end, it's important that every aspect of how the work is presented, I see it as being part of it. So the table dimensions are ones that I've lived with for months. So I did a mock-up in my studio. I got the height and I played with the dimensions of it. And then I took one home, one of the tabletops, and I put it on my dining room table and I made it up to the same height. And I did that because in the studio you go in there and you go in to do a certain kind of work, and it's a very particular kind of looking. And while your mind might wander, that's the place of business, you know, if you will. When I'm home and I'm going back and forth between the back room where my computer and desk is at home to the kitchen to get a coffee or something, I'm walking past these things and I'm looking at them, but I'm also not looking at them. And not looking is really important. It gives a lot of information. It allows me to see them, like, you know, at night when I go out there and they're kind of in the shadows. or when the light washes through my house, you know, in the morning. And those change the way they appear, and I also catch them, you know, kind of peripherally as I'm buzzing past. I'm sort of simultaneously thinking about them, but not thinking about them. And in not thinking, I think that there's a way that tacitly this information comes in to letting you get to know the thing in its entirety. And so that's sort of how I began to think about these. And when I don't look at my notes often enough, I get lost. Bear with me. The other thing I wanted to say about the tables is that proportion is kind of like the horizon line, right? So they're thinner and longer, and they sort of refer to the landscape, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then the legs come down and they're sort of attenuated. I wanted them to sit on the ground, but kind of like, you know, that sort of just touching, not flopping, you know, not having a lot of weight. And then the laminated aluminum tops are intended to tie them to the shelves that were going to be how the sculptures next to each of these photographs. And there's, for a bunch of reasons that didn't happen, which I'll explain, and also explain why later that was a very good thing in the end. But I will describe what the shelves do look like. They're a 1/4-inch aluminum plate that sits on top of a 2-inch white shelf. And they're designed to relate to the photographs, both in terms of color, tone, and reflection. The tabletops tie to the wood floors, and so they kind of, well, they look like they're sort of dancing there, but I think they have a very gestural quality. They sort of also disappear into the floor that allows them to sort of sit up there, almost like they're floating. And then the wood of the tables tying to the floor, and then these objects on the tables sort of eventually tying back to the Versailles photographs. So ultimately, I want my beholder to be absorbed into the work. In each instance, I consider that individually to each series. So in other words, these frames, everything plays off of the tones and the colors. This is really simple, but then there's a spacer, so you can kind of move into it. And then there's this white border around it, right? So that this idea that it's not as though it's just presenting itself to you, but there's a series of steps you take before you enter into the image proper. This series, this is actually on this wall, is Fictional Reality, the photograph and its object. And it's where all of this work has originated from. I was making these paper forms, and it was time to document them, and which I'm terrible about doing. Generally speaking, it coincided with my purchasing a digital camera, which was something I was never going to embrace except for documenting my work. And because of that, I used to go to the library and I'd always check one out, but every time you check one out, they give you a different model. And I don't know if any of you have tackled a digital camera, but every single model acts differently, and the buttons and dials are all different, and it was really frustrating, so I finally broke down and bought one. And as I was playing with the new lenses and things, I was photographing these initially to document them, and I became really interested in the way that, you know, by changing my angle or changing my focal point, I could suddenly take this thing where I was being completely truthful. So none of these they're not lit at all. This is the light as it comes in my studio. In this particular series, I maintained, when I printed, the aspect ratio at the general setting in the camera. In other words, the height to the width of them. And I didn't do anything to alter them in any way. I wanted them to be as pure a document as they could possibly be. Yeah?
Did you take the photos at the same time of the day, or did you do different times and get different lighting?
That's yes.
Okay.
So, in other words, these were all shot pretty much within a few days of one another, pretty much late afternoon, but the lighting conditions change, and if a cloud goes by, you know, it's darker. And just a few minutes changes the angle that the sun's coming in. And so then the other thing that happened is I became very interested in like moments where, you know, you have this kind of glowing light come out, but then that also becomes like a line in space. you know, and then this begins to flatten out even though we know it's an open form. And so I began to think about them as well, about drawings in space. So, for instance, you know, moments where just the way the light hit on another paper, you know, kind of reduces to like a line drawing. And when I'm talking about like how different they look, this sculpture is actually the larger one on the end of that table.
On the first one.
Yeah, and then along those lines, this smaller one on that table is actually the first two photographs on this side. Right, so the idea that you can never actually really come to know an object, it's something that's really fascinated me for a long time. I've always thought of myself as an object maker, and so that idea that these things that are, you know, concrete and right in front of us, you know, and again, I'm not altering. The thing I did in this series, which I called Fictional Reality, Photographing this Object, G2, because it was group 2, I felt like I'd only touched the surface there, and I hadn't really completely thought things through. So here, this one is only using 3 sculptures, and so on this side, I've sort of mapped them out in that way. So these 2 are the same sculpture, these 5 are the same sculpture, and the last 4 are the same sculpture. But that idea about the light, you know, shows up in moments like this where, you know, this one's much warmer than the other 3, and a lot cooler, and the way the light is just like bouncing off of it in that particular moment. And this one, it looks as though it's collapsed, but in fact, I just shifted the angle a little bit more, you know, and so it hasn't quite collapsed yet. And so it's those kinds of really subtle differences that I've been after.
Are these 2 the same? Because I'm looking at the light reflection at the bottom.
Yes. Actually, these 5 are all the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something else I should say, maybe it makes more sense to say it right here about these, is that it's paper, and they're paper and string, and well, hopefully you never lose sight of that. I don't try to make them appear to be something other than what they are, which is really kind of dumb, mundane materials, right? It's just paper, it's just string that I got at the grocery store that I've had in my studio for like the last couple decades, and there's nothing about that, but that yet, by virtue of how I'm shifting the angles and how I'm responding to them in that particular moment, and in that moment I think that these each become an index for that moment in time that's never going to be repeated again. I mean, there's subtle differences, but that's never going to happen. Yeah.
Are all of these, like the series of 5, are they just different angles and the paper sculpture is fixed? Or in any of these, do you turn the sculpture to get another?
I just keep turning and yeah.
So the sculpture is that way as it was conceived and intended?
I think I'm misunderstanding. Let me.
Well, I'm coming at it from a photography perspective, and if I had an object I wanted to photograph, I would probably look at it from different angles.
Yeah.
I might turn it over.
Oh yes, I am doing that.
Oh,
Yeah. In this one, the first 2 are the same orientation, where it's kind of this face down and
okay.
turned, and this one it's sitting up.
So that puts a different sort of perspective on the sculpture itself. You had it there like that, but it really could be
Yes. It could be
perceived in other orientations.
Sure.
That's the base and that's the top. Yeah. And that's how you think when you create it, is from seeing in all directions, 3 dimensions, not just
Yes.
a bottom and a top.
Right. Yeah.
Sculpture, I haven't asked artists a lot of questions about sculpture before, it's fascinating. Thank you.
So when I'm making them, there's a number of things that are happening. They're not the kind of thing that I can necessarily plan out, because in order to tie them off, I've got to hold them, and in order to have sort of the top, in order to have the tautness of the curves that I want, because that surface tension is really important to me. I usually have to hold them in tension, and then I use an awl, and then I've got a tapestry needle and the thread in that already cut and ready to go, and so then I picked it up, but then they still have to maintain that tension to get them tied. They're also, all of them are backed with archival Tyvek. Tyvek is, there's that stuff, you know, they put on houses when they're building it to keep the moisture barrier. Well, there's also an archival version that people in bookmaking use, and I think it goes under the layer of the outside part of the book cover finish. Anyway, what happens though is it gives it a tauter surface, and so I think that it brings out sort of the porosity. It's cotton rag paper. It's paper that's used generally in printmaking, sometimes watercolor. So it's a heavy paper, but the surface tension of it, I think, shifts when I adhere the Tyvek to it, so that when it folds, it tightens up.
Does the white look different on the Tyvek side?
Yes, yeah.
So you're applying the Tyvek to the file
I do.
before you fold it?
Yeah, actually, what I do is I prepare a really large sheet of paper, and then I use an archival glue. I roll that on. I squeegee it out, and then I weight it and leave it for a couple of days. I should also note the way that so much of life is, you know, you happen to that is not the direction you're going. I was actually working on a 6-foot by 12-foot drawing, and it was with graphite, and it was very subtle. It was horizon line. And Williamsburg, as I'm sure is true here, there's a lot of humidity, and I had the paper up, and it was buckling, and it was buckling so much that you saw more of the buckle than you saw of the drawing. And so I called and I talked to a bunch of people, and I finally talked to the, and then I got this idea. I thought, I know, I'll just back it with the Tyvek, you know, because that'll strengthen it. It's not going to buckle. And I did that, and of course it did. And so I called the paper conservator at Colonial Williamsburg, who very kindly said to me that I needed to embrace the paper's paperness. And that no matter what I did, she just laughed, and she said, "It's Williamsburg. It is going to buckle. Embrace it." And so I went back to the studio, and I took the drawing down, I rolled it up, and I put it in the tube. So I just could not embrace its paperness. And then I had all this prepared paper around, and I guess it's kind of an interesting thing. You know, every time you sort of ship somewhere, you think you've like come out of nowhere. And I thought, okay, well, where the heck are these things coming from? I'd been doing this series that I called Signatures, where I was folding the paper and, like, you know, going from crossing the gutter, you know, if you will, creating, you know, this continuation and thinking about, you know, a drawing, which I'm always thinking about, you know, drawing in space and making my sculptures draw at the same time, you know, maybe thinking about the sculptures, you know, in 2 dimensions. And so, you know, that idea of folding paper and stuff like that wasn't foreign. But, you know, I hadn't sort of tied it together, and so I did these, and I was thinking about it. For a good 25 years, I worked in plaster. And the way I worked in plaster was I used expandable metal lath, which is pretty pliable. They use it in concrete reinforcement. And the way that I formed those pieces was I would cut the mesh, and I would fold it, and I would tie it off with baling wire in exactly the same way that I've been treating the paper sculptures. So lo and behold, you know, everything always just comes right back around. But that idea of kind of materials that are modest and you know, ordinary, and the simplest gesture, you know, just snipping something and like making a dart and folding it together, that I can do that and create something that becomes completely other is sort of always been at the core of what I'm doing. This series, so I go from that series to this series. I increase this aspect ratio. It's getting a little more cinematographic in its ratio, but it's not quite there. I mean, I think I'm still working in that direction. To this group, which I call Blur. Another thing I've always been interested in, I've always been trying to do is, like, you can make a blurry photograph, you can make a blurry drawing, and how you make a blurry sculpture, and I'm still not sure how you do that. And you can do one that kind of talks about being blurry, but you can't actually make one that's blurry, and there's something about that I can't let go of. But these, I did increase the aspect ratio, and it is getting much more cinematographic. And I started playing with the focus a lot more. you know, so that this just becomes like a beam of light, or the way that, you know, this rim picks up right here is really important. And that they go back and forth between, oh, and you also see that these I bled to the edge. There's no border around them, because they sort of move back and forth between being these moments of kind of light and this glow and an object. And so that's kind of where they go back and forth. But here, what I'm talking about, when I'm talking about that, the porosity of the surface and where it feels more skin-like, when you look really close at it, you know, you can see that there's, you know, it's not just a sheet of paper, it's got all these other qualities. And I look for moments like, you know, this line, but then, you know, the reflection is really beginning to take on a much larger role here. The way that the horizon line, you know, is very subtly present in the back, and then sometimes drops out completely, has also been really important.
I was gonna ask, before you mentioned horizon line, that's something that suddenly I picked up on different places or use of this, which gives you a transition. So, I mean, you always, that brings a landscape component to it.
Yes.
So you just pick where you put that in relation to.
Well, actually, they're all sitting on top of my flat files in my studio. So I've got this big drawers of flat files that are painted white, and it's me changing my height.
Right.
So they're all sitting exactly the same height. But like, you know, this is, I just flipped it over and I actually, you know, came down lower or went up higher, kind of thing. And so just those shifts kind of shift how it is we know them, how it is, and their scale, you know.
Now, what is the dark line? I paint and I'll put it in a seascape or something, that horizon line.
It's where the space where the top of the file meets the wall.
Okay, so it's sort of shadow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's actually just a hair of space, which I think adds to that.
What is your background and what is the surface? I know you say it was a flat file, but is it wood? Is it aluminum?
It's just white enamel.
White enamel?
Yeah, and it's just a white sheetrock wall. Although I'm starting to play with plexi because I really wanted to, as a surface, because I really wanted to up the reflection and play with that more.
Have you photographed on aluminum?
I haven't photographed on aluminum yet. Actually, I'm trying to figure out how to photograph these, because what happens is, in the camera, it picks up all the lines of light, and so it's hard to photograph these. But yeah, I'm slowly starting to play with that. But that, as it butts up against a white wall. But we're actually in a perfect place if we turn around. So on this series of photographs, and these are gelatin silver prints. It was a very overcast, cold day in Versailles. I was on a residency for a couple of months in Paris at the Cité des Arts Internationales in Paris. And I went out to Versailles. I'd been photographing the sort of squares and parks and formal gardens in Paris, and the Versailles has got this really grand formal garden. And the thing that I was really struck by was that, you know, these formal gardens, for the most part, are all very symmetrical. Very symmetrical, but yet the way you come to them is always obliquely, you know, so that, like, when you look at a plan of them, or you see an aerial view of them, you know, it's all very ordered and stuff. But when you're interacting with them, you know, you're constantly always coming at things from angles. And so that's what these are about. These were, I actually started these several years ago, and I originally wanted them to go on the wall, because I was thinking about them as drawings, but I was thinking about them too as like sections of you know, gardens. And that's not true of all of them. It's more true this kind of arrangement, this kind of arrangement. And the one that's back up there. And then I've recently been venturing into doing some 3D printing. And this is a form that is the same dimension regardless of what angle you hold it at. And I was really struck by how it becomes like the topiary in the photographs. And so there's that idea of playing back and forth between these as being sort of small landscapes where I'm trying to figure out that relationship and that kind of movement. At the same time that I'm also playing with scale, sort of in a similar way that I do with the photographs. And that is, trying to, closer things are supposed to be bigger and smaller things are supposed to be further away. But like when you orient yourself, to like the one in the top right corner, and if you're looking at it from this direction, the furthest away is actually the larger object. And so the idea of just beginning to play with things the same way that I play with them in the photograph. The idea that the topiaries and the shrouded sculptures, covered for winter, suddenly become like sentries standing guard, or the topiaries become more just like forms in space. And then in terms of the framing of these, they decided that the weight on the bottom sort of takes them and grounds them, but it moves you. And then I use the double thick mat because that creates another movement into it with a border shown outside the image itself before you get into it. But if you stand back from them, that kind of grounds you in the space and acts as a stepping in so that you eventually move into the horizon line at the same time that they tend to ground you more physically in the space, if that makes sense. So the framing for me is as much a part of it as the shelves and the things. Oh, I didn't tell you about the shelves though. So when I came to install, 1/4-inch aluminum plate is actually heavier than you think, and the walls don't have backing, and so I couldn't get the shelves to sit securely. And at first I thought, oh, darn, I really wanted them like that, because I've shown them before, but in smaller groupings, not the entire series with their shelf. But each of these paper sculptures is a different size, so each of the shelves is specific to it in a different size. And in the end, what would have happened is there would have been an incredible disruption. When you look at the symmetry of what's going on in here and the balance of it, I knowing me, would have hung them all, would have stepped back and said, yeah, no, that's way too chaotic, and then taken them all down, and I would have had to spackle and paint the whole place. So in the end, it caused me to step back and really reflect on them, and so that's what happened to the shelves. But I tell you only so that it ties everything back together. So anyway, it just leaves me back at the horizon line and sitting at the ocean and looking across and just thinking about the possibilities. Question? Yes.
I'd like to talk about the tables.
Okay.
You designed the tables
Yes.
and built the tables?
A friend helped me.
The chap that came over.
So he's brilliant with a CNC router.
Oh,
So he
good.
programmed that and was able to cut the legs.
I see it as part of, as much a part of the exhibit as what's on
I do too.
the person.
Yes.
Now you will use them over and over.
I might. It just seems that every time I do something, it has to address a different space. So I would certainly use them again. I don't know. Yeah, I would use them again.
They certainly work well here.
Yes, well, they were designed specifically for here. So one of the things when I first came here, several years ago, the first show I saw, I was just struck by the space overall. And when I started working on this show, it was clear I knew I wanted to do something in the center, but it took a while. So I came out and hung out here a few times to sort of get a sense of what I thought might need to happen.
Very
So it's in response specifically to this space.
It's wonderful.
How are you gonna store these, and scratch these?
So I cover them with glassine, take that down, and a cardboard in between. And actually, the tops aren't attached. Good. So there's 2 bars coming across. And we actually did it so we could put some set pins in there, but that seemed like it was the potential was scratch and mess up the aluminum. great learning.
They came over smacked in the back of a pickup truck.
But these were packed separately.
Yeah, these were the base of these.
Do you use white gloves when you're handling your paper?
No, I probably should, but I don't.
No greasy marks?
No, and you know, it's really funny, I find myself constantly wiping these, because I'm terrified of touch. The paper, I don't know. I haven't thought about that.
You don't eat when you're doing it.
No, I don't do that. No. And I don't, I do that if I stop and have lunch and I go back to work, I do wash my hands.
Are they attached to the table?
No.
Like if it was outside and the wind's blowing?
They would blow off.
Okay.
What kind of adhesive did you say you used?
Oh, on these?
For the tie-back?
Oh, for the tie-back,
paper?
it's jade glue, it's an archival glue, jade, J-A-D, so it's, bookmaking supply again.
Oh,
And an incredibly toxic adhesive for, applying the aluminum to the wood. That was big respirators.
I was kind of impressed with the range of warms and cools without the use of color. In other words, you were basically using black and white photography or color photography.
These are all color, those are
Okay.
the only black and white, yeah.
Yeah, all right, so initially you're thinking you're shooting black and white because you see it, but then those warms and cools is what shows that there's a hint of color, because you can get just a hint of warm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really love, I love that, you know, the fact that this one is, you know, so much warmer than the other three, and this was only moments away.
Just because the lighting was different.
The light was different, and I think, yeah, I think the light kind of bounced too. You know, something different.
And it's, you know, also the light on that was very similar.
It's like, I mean, that side, these down here, you know, even though they're all shot in the same, I'm pretty sure these were all the same day. Well, over 2 days, I guess, but, you know, it really shifts down here versus here, it's so much darker. Oh, I saw the three that are here, the three that are all present. So I have some others from the did on the Prince Cross. And we did all this solution and these, actually, they all have this material. And I'm really so sorry. It's like a non-absorbent, this replaces the material, it's warm to it. So I'm kind of fascinated by this resin.